Finding out my family sold my inheritance behind my back was a gut punch I wouldn't wish on anyone. They really thought they could get away with it and leave me with nothing while they cashed in. I was ready to give up, heartbroken that the people I trusted most had stabbed me in the back. But just as I was accepting my defeat, my lawyer called me into his office. He had been digging through the will and found a hidden section everyone else missed. It turns out that one forgotten clause was about to turn the tables on them, and I was finally going to get the last laugh. The downtown area bustled with midday traffic as Emily Johnson pulled her sedan into a narrow parking spot. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror and took a steady breath before opening the door. The large brick office building loomed ahead, casting a long shadow over the sidewalk. This was the place where she hoped to find answers about her grandfather's will. She clutched her purse tightly and began the walk toward the entrance. Emily pushed against the heavy glass doors and stepped into the climate-controlled lobby. The cool air hit her face instantly, a stark contrast to the humidity outside. She walked across the polished marble floor toward the reception area. A receptionist sat behind a tall, imposing desk, typing rapidly on a computer. Emily cleared her throat to get the woman's attention. She needed to see Mark Reynolds immediately regarding an urgent estate matter. The receptionist checked the schedule and nodded before standing up to lead the way. Emily followed her down a long, quiet hallway lined with framed degrees and abstract art. The silence in the corridor felt heavy, amplifying the sound of their footsteps on the carpet. They finally stopped at the end of the hall in front of a solid wooden door. A small brass plaque mounted on the wood simply read "Private." The door opened to reveal a spacious office filled with the scent of old paper and leather. Attorney Mark Reynolds stood up from his high-backed chair as soon as Emily entered the room. He reached across the mahogany desk and offered a firm handshake. His expression was serious, lacking the usual pleasantries one might expect. He gestured for Emily to take the seat opposite him so they could get straight to business. Mark wasted no time with small talk and immediately reached for a thick file folder on his desk. He flipped it open and pulled out several yellowed documents that looked decades old. He arranged them carefully in front of Emily, lining up the edges with precision. These papers contained the original legal language from her grandfather's estate planning. He tapped his finger on the top document, signaling that the situation was critical. After the meeting, Emily got back into her car and navigated through the city traffic toward the suburbs. She needed to confront her family before taking any further legal steps. The drive to her parents' house felt longer than usual as she rehearsed what she might say. She pulled into the driveway and saw her brother's truck parked next to the garage. They were all inside, likely celebrating their recent financial victory. Emily entered the house and found her family gathered in the living room. Her brother sat comfortably on the couch, looking entirely too pleased with himself. He noticed her glare and simply pointed to a stack of papers on the coffee table. These were the signed sale documents that finalized the transfer of the estate. He leaned back and crossed his arms, seemingly unbothered by her obvious distress over the transaction. Her mother stood by the coffee table and poured tea into floral porcelain cups. She looked up at Emily and offered a weak smile, acting as if this were a normal social visit. She insisted that selling the estate was purely a necessary business decision for the family's future. In her view, holding on to the property was a burden they could no longer afford. She placed the teapot down and waited for Emily to agree. Emily ignored the tea and reached for the documents lying on the table. She picked them up and began scanning the pages for the critical details. The signatures of the buyers were scrawled in blue ink at the bottom. Right next to them were the signatures of her mother and brother, authorizing the sale. Seeing their names in black and white confirmed that they had finalized the deal without ever consulting her. She stared at the papers for a moment longer before dropping them back onto the table. The urge to scream at them was strong, but she knew it would solve nothing. Instead, she turned around and walked toward the front door. Her mother called out her name, but Emily did not stop or look back. She left the house in silence, knowing that her next conversation with them would be through her lawyer. The next morning, Emily returned to the law firm with a renewed sense of purpose. Mark Reynolds was already waiting for her when she arrived at his office. The atmosphere was different today, charged with a specific tactical energy. They needed to review the specific details of the will that he had uncovered the previous day. Mark opened the file again, ready to explain exactly how they would proceed against her family. Mark turned to the third page of the yellowed document and smoothed it out on the desk. He took a pen from his pocket and pointed the tip at a small paragraph near the bottom. The text was dense and printed in a smaller font than the rest of the will. It was easy to overlook if someone was just skimming for asset distribution. This was the section that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. He began to read the legal text aloud in a clear, measured voice. Emily leaned in closer, following the lines with her finger as he spoke. The words were complex, but their meaning started to become clear as he broke them down. Her grandfather had anticipated potential family conflicts long before his death. As Mark read on, Emily realized that this paragraph was designed to protect the estate's integrity. The lawyer explained that this section was known as an anti-greed stipulation. It specifically addressed the scenario of the estate being sold without the consent of all named heirs. Her grandfather had inserted this rule to prevent any single family member from liquidating the assets for quick cash. Since Emily had never agreed to the sale, her family had directly violated this specific condition. The will was explicit about the consequences of such an action. Mark handed Emily a yellow highlighter and instructed her to mark the section. She pressed the tip against the paper and drew a bright line through the text. This marked document would serve as the centerpiece of their evidence in court. By highlighting it, they were formally acknowledging the violation of the will's terms. It was the first step in legally challenging the validity of the sale precedes distribution. While Emily waited in her car outside the courthouse, Mark went inside to file the motions. He carried a briefcase containing the highlighted will and the proof of the unauthorized sale. Emily watched the building entrance, her heart racing with a mix of nerves and adrenaline. This legal filing would officially freeze the assets and alert the bank. Minutes later, Mark emerged from the courthouse doors, signaling that the paperwork was lodged. They took Emily's car and drove toward the bank branch, where the transaction was scheduled to settle. Mark checked his watch, calculating the time it would take for the court order to register in the system. Her family was likely already there, waiting to deposit the check from the buyers. The timing had to be perfect to catch them in the act. They pulled into the bank's parking lot just as the noon rush began. Inside the bank, Emily's mother and brother stood at the main teller counter. They looked impatient, shifting their weight as the teller processed their request. The large settlement check lay on the counter between them, waiting to be converted into cash. They were completely unaware that their transaction had triggered a red flag in the system. Emily watched them from the entrance, staying just out of their direct line of sight. Suddenly, the branch manager stepped out from a back office with a grim look on his face. He approached the teller station and held up a hand to pause the transaction. He spoke quietly to the teller before turning his attention to Emily's family. Her brother looked confused and started to argue, pointing at the check. The manager remained firm, shaking his head and refusing to proceed with the deposit. Mark seized the moment and strode confidently across the bank lobby. He reached the counter and slapped a folder containing the restraining order down between the family and the manager. The loud sound of the paperwork hitting the surface silenced the brothers' protests instantly. Mark announced that all funds related to the estate sale were now under court jurisdiction. The family stared at the lawyer in shock, realizing their plan had been intercepted. The manager invited everyone into the glass-walled conference room to sort out the legalities. Emily's mother and brother sat on one side of the table, looking pale and nervous. The manager put on his reading glasses and carefully reviewed the court order Mark had provided. The atmosphere in the small room was suffocatingly tense. He compared the account numbers and the stipulations listed in the legal decree. The manager looked up from the documents and explained the final ruling of the clause. Because the family had sold the property without Emily's consent, the will mandated a specific penalty. The stipulation stated that 100% of the proceeds from an unauthorized sale must be forfeited to the excluded heir. This meant the entire purchase price of the estate belonged solely to Emily. Her family would receive absolutely nothing from the sale. A heavy silence fell over the room as the reality of the situation sank in. The manager turned to his computer and began typing rapidly to execute the court's instructions. He initiated a transfer of the full settlement amount directly into Emily's personal savings account. The funds moved instantly, leaving the joint family account completely untouched. Emily watched the confirmation screen appear, validating the transfer. Her brother stood up and leaned over the desk to look at the monitor. He stared in disbelief at the zero balance remaining on his side of the ledger. Her mother slumped back in her chair, covering her face with her hands. 2 security guards appeared at the doorway of the conference room to ensure a peaceful exit. The manager gestured for the guards to escort the defeated family members out of the bank. Emily remained in the conference room for a moment longer to finalize the paperwork. She signed the receipt confirming the deposit of her full inheritance. The weight of the past few weeks lifted off her shoulders as she put the pen down. She thanked the manager and walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sun. Justice had been served, and her future was finally secure.